Well, hello, Josh. How are you?
Doing well, Johnny. How are you?
I'm good. We're hanging in there. We're into mid-March now, at least at the recording of this. So mid-March 2025, still plenty to talk about with the wild world of our current administration. And tonight we're going to be talking about free speech and censorship, which there's a lot to cover. We're going to try to keep this as brief as we can, without going down too many rabbit holes. But the reason we had this idea, right, goes all the way back to what was it, late January. I mean, this idea I think has been kicking around in our heads for a while, because it's so prescient on all kinds of different fronts, from education to social media to, accusations about partisanship. But President or Vice President J.D. Vance raised this kind of specter of censorship when he first gave his first speech abroad in Europe, at Munich, to the Europeans in the early days of the administration here, and he basically chided the Europeans for not respecting free speech, right? For censoring what he said were the people, right? The way he put it is, he was basically accusing Europe of being anti-democratic because it censors far right or alt-right groups. Um, and he said democracy rests on the sacred principle that the voice of the people matters, right? And that there can be no room for firewalls. And what he's talking about there is that Germany famously has prevented the far right extremist groups within Germany from participating in German government. Um, for obvious historical reasons, right? Germany being the breadbasket of Nazism, the most extreme fascism of the 20th century, and trying to avoid ever falling back into that, for obvious reasons. And so Vance accuses them, right, in this speech of being anti-democratic because they censor far right parties, and in that sense, he's basically saying that, society's role of keeping the extreme elements at bay is, kind of anti-democratic or an attack on democracy. And he talked a lot in that speech about the enemy within, right? And he was referring back to America as much as he was talking about Europe at that stage. What's he mean by the enemy within, Josh, if you were to interpret that term? Because that seemed to be what he cares most about, right? In that speech, he's much less worried about the Russians. He's much less worried about, you know, um, elements or enemies abroad. He's worried about the enemy within, and directly as it relates to kind of censorship and free speech, which Vance claims to be a proponent of free speech, a defender of free speech. He's super active on social media in that sphere. So who's the enemy within? Who do we have to watch out for, according to Vance?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, that's a good question. So I'll take all your good quotations and research and raise you with one Spider-Man meme. Um, I mean, the enemy within. So I think, free speech is certainly a good example of this. But as we kind of alluded to in our very first episode, we're currently kind of situated in a world where it seems like, let's say with the US, half the country is in one set of facts and one reality, and the other half the country is in an alternative reality. And, we're sitting here saying this, but people that we would criticize would basically reenact this meme you see here and point right back at us and say, well, we're the ones that are, we're going to talk about censorship and free speech, but, we're the ones that are
Perpetrating
perpetrating it,
censorship.
right?
Yeah.
Um, I think in terms of who the enemy within, I think Vance would probably say the cultural Marxists, right? And that's such a loaded phrase, such a loaded term, such an ambiguous term, much like woke or
Yeah,
wokeism.
that's what I was going to say. A few years ago, it would have been social justice warriors or woke warriors, right? That are censoring free speech. That would have been the
Yeah.
accusation. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, without getting too into the weeds, I think, how would you describe cultural Marxism? I mean, first of all, it has antecedents in the Nazi Party's term cultural Bolshevism,
Hmm.
but coming out of like maybe the 1990s as like a fringe far right movement, it's this idea that there's this intellectual and very academic effort to destroy kind of traditional Western values, traditional conservative values, and replace them with, something more culturally liberal. Um,
Socialism of some
Socialist
sort.
or
Yeah.
globalist is one of those
Right.
words that falls within this. If you're a cultural Marxist, you're a globalist. Um, but it's specifically an intellectual and academic movement that the far right sees as infringing on their free speech, right? So when I think Vance is referring to the enemy within, it'd be some variation of academics and intellectuals who want to silence the far right from having a platform.
Right, which is what he was essentially accusing the Europeans of doing, kind of undercutting or silencing these alt-right, far-right groups in places like Germany and the UK and France. And so, this gets at the question of free speech, because essentially the gauntlet that Vance lays down there is that, well, you've got to let these people express their views, right? Um, and I like the idea of free speech. You like the idea of free speech, I think, Josh, right? We don't like the idea of getting policed for sharing personal opinions or anything like that. It's very, there's something very it sounds anti-American to say we're going to cut down on free speech. But we have to think logically about what that actually means in the context of the way JD Vance is talking about it. Um, where is free speech allowed? Where is it not allowed? What's protected in the Constitution? What's not protected in the Constitution? Um, so free speech is one of these things that comes out of not the Constitution itself, but the First Amendment, right? Your First Amendment rights include the right to free speech, and this is part of the Bill of Rights that gets tacked on as part of the initial ratification of the Constitution. Um,
Mhm.
so, free speech in that sense means you're protected to say whatever you want. Protected
Yeah.
against who?
Well, I mean, let me just read it. Let me just read the
Yeah,
First Amendment
good.
real quick, just because.
Right, because people
Um,
always say they know their First Amendment rights, and I'm not sure if I can't recite it off the top of my head, but
yeah, let's see. First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
okay, so we got religion, we got freedom of the press, we've got free speech, and we got freedom of assembly. All of those are covered by by the First Amendment, but it's specifically, right, about what the government can prevent you from doing or not prevent you from doing. So the way the First Amendment works, right, is that the government cannot infringe on your right to practice your religion. It can't infringe on your right to free speech. It can't infringe on your right to freely assemble, and it can't infringe on the rights of a free press. newspapers, is what they were talking about in 1787. But that's obviously morphed into all kinds of different news networks now in the 21st century. Um, but it's specifically about the relationship between these entities, with religion, press, people, and the government itself. So the
Yeah.
government can't censor us, right? That's the good news. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, but right, a lot of the critiques that Vance and Trump and others have levied, right, where they see censorship is not about the government coming after them for what they're saying, or it's not about the government censoring far right groups, right? It's about this being censored in society, in social media, on campuses, institutes of higher education, that kind of stuff, right? Um,
Yeah, I mean they would push back and say, in the case of social media, it's the fact that the government is pressuring the social media companies to moderate. Now, is that, I mean, yeah, well, that's not, I mean, we don't really, I guess, know, but the Supreme Court did rule in 2024 that, there was no proof whatsoever that the Biden administration pressured, Facebook and Twitter to kind of regulate or moderate their own platforms at the
right.
behest of the government. But the people, I think the far right proponents of this would say it's the government in some way behind the scenes, pulling the levers. But yeah, you're right. Like to cite those venues, I think in my mind, just in thinking about this, there's really two venues and two different types of speech, both of which are protected by the First Amendment that we need to kind of dismantle a bit. So the one venue would be academia and
Higher ed, yeah.
universities, campuses, and I think the form of speech you see there most hotly contested is hate speech, right?
Yeah.
And the kind of the claims that students are canceling or deplatforming, proponents who want to put forth some version of hate speech that is again constitutionally protected. And then the second venue would be the social media companies and their content moderation of what you might call false speech
Hmm.
or misinformation or
Misinformation.
disinformation,
Yeah.
right? And that's all circulating around um COVID and uh kind of claims, like let's say false claims about how to treat it or whatever.
Vaccines, yeah, right. Take a
Yeah,
horse pill, whatever. All of the
right.
stuff. I mean, there
Drink
were
bleach.
people, yeah,
Yeah.
during, uh, I mean, you remember during the height of the pandemic, I can remember on my social media, right? I I saw some of the stuff people were posting that was deemed by Facebook unscientific or false news or misleading. I saw a lot of people complaining about stuff they had posted that had been supposedly taken down by Facebook for being misinformation. That kind of stuff definitely took off during COVID and probably has kept up since then. Now I know, Facebook has changed its policies recently. Um,
Hmm.
as it's kind of come in line with the Trump administration on this, but
Yeah.
they've taken the guardrails off, so to speak, about what kinds of false news is being circulated on social media.
Yeah.
And that's just one venue, one social media platform. But as we know, right, the same thing happened with Twitter when it became X under Elon Musk. Um, there's less vetting of sources now on those sites. So um,
Right.
that's one way in which, a lot of these kind of censorships have been removed on those social media platforms. Um, and then, yeah, like institutes of higher ed hosting people or having someone come in for a talk who's deemed controversial. And again, I think this was particularly notable during the Black Lives Matter moment, and then kind of the backlash to the Black Lives Matter moment, where you have these right wing um, thinkers and personalities coming in and getting potentially censored, potentially protested while they're on campus, at the invitation of something like Young Americans for Freedom,
Mhm.
Young Republicans or something. Uh, and those are definitely cases where like cross the line kind of into hate speech potentially, right? If they're sharing
Yeah.
racist views or prejudicial views against certain groups. Um, and so this
Yeah.
is all the stuff that Vance is supposedly pushing back against, right? That he wants an open forum. I think this is like kind of the phrasing that he would use, right? Where we're going to have kind of this marketplace of ideas, and you should be able to defeat ideas you disagree with if they're inferior or something like that. Um, and this,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
It reminds me of, there's a play I saw a couple years ago with a friend in uh just off the UCLA's campus, and it's called The Power of Sale.
okay,
And it had Bryan Cranston as the lead. And it honestly wasn't that great of a play, but basically it's about this issue of speech on campuses, right? So Bryan Cranston played this esteemed, I think, Harvard professor
okay,
who was going to bring on a Holocaust denier onto campus to speak. And, all of his graduate students were like, dude, what are you doing? And his rationale, which the play ultimately undercuts, his rationale was to say the answer to hate speech is more speech, right? And I think that maybe is like Vance's. I mean, we're saying Vance, but it really is just the far right in general.
the whole
Um,
thinking, yeah,
their logic is like, well, we should not take away anyone's platform. If you really think this is bad speech, whether it's hate speech or disinformation, the answer is to have more of it. Like counter it in an open forum, right? Um, there's a conversation to have there. I mean, like, sure, I think if we're talking about it in a very academic sense, as an intellectual exercise, like, yeah, of course we should have that model. But at the same time, we're living within real world parameters where hate speech has ramifications. People are dying from COVID in the early 2020s.
yep,
So it's worth taking that ideal, I think, and putting it into a real world context.
right,
Um, I don't know. Do you have any
yeah,
thoughts on that?
yeah. Well, this is I mean, you know, tolerating free speech, I think, is a great ideal to aspire to. I'm right there with you. This is the misquoted Voltaire quote about I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend your right to say it, right, or whatever. Um, that works up to a point, but at some point, right, if rumors are spreading, misinformation is spreading, um, I mean, to pick on Vance some more, right? If you are not vetting your sources and you're spreading the rumor that there are millions of Haitians eating pets in Ohio, right? That's clearly a problem, right? Because that's either going to incite panic or anger or hate, right? Or racism towards a group, and you have no actual facts to back it up, right? And that's just one example, fairly recent example, right? But in the
Yeah.
COVID context, it's even worse, right? If you're spreading misinformation about how to treat COVID, what COVID symptoms look like, you know, take this medicine that's actually poisonous to treat it. That can actually lead to innocent people dying from misinformation. Um, that's a problem, right? Like that. There is a limit to how much misinformation you should potentially be allowed to spread.
Yeah. I
Uh,
mean, it gets into another way of thinking about this is a phrase that we've seen circulating here and there recently, which is the paradox of tolerance,
yeah,
right? So, and that's building on, that goes back to like Plato. and the paradox of freedom, and the idea that if everyone has unchecked freedom, then you are free to go take away the freedoms of other people, right?
That's
Uh, so, I think in a modern sense, the paradox of tolerance comes up in 1945 with a British philosopher and social commentator named Karl Popper. And
okay.
he talks about this in his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. So let me just read a passage um, on how he defines this, because it's getting back into the same question in a different way. Okay, so this is the paradox of tolerance. He says, unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and the tolerance with them. In this formulation, I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies. As long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion, suppression would certainly be most unwise. But we should claim the right to suppress them if necessary, even by force, for it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument because it is deceptive, and teach them to answer arguments by the use of their fists or pistols. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right to not tolerate the intolerant. We should claim that any movement preaching intolerance places itself outside the law, and we should consider incitement to intolerance and persecution as criminal, in the same way as we should consider incitement to murder or to kidnapping or to the revival of the slave trade as criminal. So that's published in 1945,
Right
again, in
after
this
World
World War
War
II
II.
context
Yep.
we're always coming out of. And I think Popper is really speaking in a very British context coming out of World War II.
Right.
Um,
1945. Yeah.
yeah, and like as you were mentioning with Vance in the beginning in Germany, it's technically illegal to kind of spread lies about the Holocaust and be in you'd say
Right.
Holocaust denial in Germany today.
Yeah.
Certainly that's not the case.
Swastikas, Nazi paraphernalia, totally
Yeah, yeah, it's much
out.
closer to home there, right? So they're much more guarded in that sense and much
Yep.
more restrictive of their free speech. And it does seem like Popper is getting to a point where he's saying, if you can't reason with people through rational argument, then there is sometimes you do have the right to suppress them.
To police them. But the interesting thing about that quote, I think the one of the more important parts of that quote, and this is what Vance and Trump and others take umbrage with, is he says if society, right, can combat those views, right? So he's not even calling, at least not at first. He's not calling for the government to suppress these views. He's calling for society to put pressure on these abhorrent views, whether it's Nazis or, you know, communists or whoever, right? Society has a role in kind of policing that kind of speech. And this is where, a protest on a campus against a speaker that people don't like, that's that's a way to police things as a society, right?
Mhm.
If someone I don't like, shares abhorrent views, gross views, violent views, racist views on Twitter, it's my right to, flag that or call them out as a racist or whatever, right? That's not censorship. That's not government censorship. That's a society beating down the hateful views, the dumber views, and that's okay. As a matter of fact, that's kind of, you want to talk
Yeah.
about a marketplace of ideas, that to me sounds like a totally viable response.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that gets cast as censorship, is what I'm trying to argue, right? Like that is then seen as like, oh, woke warriors, social justice warriors are policing my free speech. It's like, no, that's actually what a society is supposed to do when you say something out of line. Um,
Yeah.
It's not about getting canceled. It's about getting called out for something
Well,
stupid
but
you say.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And even cancel culture as a whole is just a form of boycott, and
Yeah.
boycott is protected by free speech. You know, you have the right as a
Yes.
citizen to choose to not patronize a restaurant that you don't like, or you have the right to not buy Teslas if you
Right.
don't like the owner. Like,
Yeah.
it's like that. There's nothing illegal about that. It's
No, as
it's
a matter
the
of fact, it's
opposite.
a fundamental American thing, right?
Right.
The first boycott, right? The first boycott in history, I'm going to go out on a limb here, right? The first successful boycott in history is a political boycott during the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the lead up to the American Revolution, right? When because they don't agree with the British taxes that are being imposed, American colonists organized to resist buying certain goods. Like that's a fundamental democratic exertion of, putting your money where your mouth is, the power of um, consumer protest, right? And
Mhm.
so, yeah, it's cancel culture is just an extension of that in a way, right? We have this kind of negative view of that as censorship, but it's not censorship. It's
Mhm.
people responding to things they disagree with, which is a totally legitimate thing to do. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it does. I do. I think, free speech is one of those things that the left and the right do have to fundamentally agree on it. And to a
mhm,
certain point, you should kind of want to feel the need to defend things that you might not disagree with, because in the obverse, you wouldn't want the government censoring something that you agree with.
that's
So
right.
you have to kind of support both sides
Yeah.
of speech to an extent. But the idea that Popper makes about defeating hate speech or false speech with rational argument. I mean, we're living in a postmodern world where it's very clear that you cannot can kind of rationally argue with some people.
Yeah.
You can you can tell a flat earther that the earth is not flat, and you can give them all the science in the world to prove that, and it's not really going to make a difference. So, I mean, what is I don't expect you to have the answer to this, but like, what is the answer then? What do we do as a society when you just cannot reason with people about whether or not the election was stolen in 2020, for example? Where do we
Yeah.
go?
Right. I mean, yeah, if the caveat is that you have to be able to have a rational argument, then we're beyond that. We've
We're
crossed that
cooked.
red line a while ago. Yeah. Um, I don't know. There's got to be some innate, you know, I mean, Josh and I took the same historical methods class long ago, and I remember we were talking about like the ethics of, I don't even remember the
It
ethics
was
of
it
like
was rec it was
oral
recording
histories. Yeah.
it was recording a Nazi
Yeah.
in private without telling him he was being recorded.
Yeah, but the discussion was like the ethics of like good journalism or good historical interviewing, right?
Yeah.
And I remember our professor saying, "Well, there's always like the Nazi exception, right?" And to me, that rule applies to free speech too, right? Like I'll defend free speech this way to the right, this way to the left. But at some point, when it becomes virulent and hateful and Nazi-esque and lacking all rationality, you have to cut off the far extremes on both sides and say, like, that's not acceptable, right? Like, there's got to be
Mhm.
a limit to this because if back to that quote, right? If we're all tolerant, it lets the intolerance in, and the intolerance can come to dominate the discussion, can come to dominate the so-called free marketplace of ideas because it doesn't play by the same rules, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and that's the big kind of double standard that I see currently playing out, right? So uh, Vance, Trump, they can yell all they want about free speech, they can yell all they want about censorship. But at the same time that they are projecting and accusing other people of censoring um, their free speech, they are legitimately censoring other people's free speech, right? And they are in the, if I can remind anyone, right? they are in the position of power here, right? Trump's the president. JD Vance is the vice president. Elon Musk is some, you know, uh, special envoy. I don't know what his title even is, right? Like
Tech support.
tech support, right? But the fact is, these people are the ones controlling the levers of power, right?
Yeah.
They're the government, right? That the First Amendment says we're supposed to be protected against in matters of free speech. And yet we've got multiple examples within the first 50 days here of Trump's administration purposely targeting people over matters of free speech. And this has happened in a couple different ways, right? I'm thinking first of Trump's kind of ongoing litigation against specific news outlets, right, that paint him badly. And so he's happy to sue them, right? That's one way that he does this. Sues them for libel, tries to, force them to fight that. Um, in court or pay out or whatever, or actively banning free press from the press room, right? So the Associated Press until very recently was being banned from participating in White House correspondence because of some fight they were having over what to call the Gulf of Mexico, right? Uh,
Right.
there are other examples, Josh, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's the ABC defamation lawsuit that was settled in just like what, December of last year
Yeah,
over, that all goes back to the E. Jean Carroll lawsuit that's currently being appealed, but ABC, one of the news anchors said, he was liable for rape, I think, or something like in March of last year. And
yeah,
I guess it's still because it's still being litigated, Trump was able to sue ABC and say, hey, no, like, and whatever. So they settled. CBS, with the Kamala Harris 60 Minutes interview. Um, I mean, Facebook, right? Like we've seen
uh-huh.
Facebook and Meta kind of bend the
Get
knee
targeted.
at
Yeah.
last, but still paying what, $25 million or something
Yep.
to Trump. So it's I mean, there is, I guess it's worth mentioning just as a caveat, the First Amendment does not protect speech in cases of like perjury
Yep.
or defamation. But as we see with Trump, defamation it can be used for good or ill, right? And you can
Yeah.
almost use it as a cudgel yourself to, you can say, oh, I'm upholding my honor, but at the same time, that that act can really infringe on freedom of the press in this case with
Yeah.
Trump.
Yeah. But there's been targeting of individuals too, right? Mahmoud Khalil is the big name in the news right now. This is a Columbia student who was here legally on a green card as a student at Columbia that helped organize some of the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protests last year. And seemingly, because of his role in organizing and leading those protests, he's now been singled out and arrested by or detained by ICE over an immigration problem, right? So essentially, even though he's here as a legal green card carrying student, because of his political views, he's being targeted by the Trump administration, right? And that is clearly because of his exercise of free speech and also exercise of assembly, right? His role in kind of organizing some of those protests. And again, whether you agree with those protests, right? Whether you are sympathetic to Israel, sympathetic to Palestine, sympathetic to neither group, right? Think the fighting just needs to stop. Whatever, his right as a student to protest is clearly defined in the First Amendment. And to target him from a kind of an immigration standpoint is pretty shocking, and even to kind of detain him and disappear him for a prolonged period of time. That has the makings of authoritarianism rather than a free society with due process. So
Yeah.
that one to me is quite shocking. Uh,
It's shocking, but maybe not surprising.
yeah,
There's there's certainly the element of MAGA, which would say, well, you can't take these guys seriously. You gotta, cut through the noise and look for the signal. And I think people like us would say, well, I think the noise also matters. Trust me,
Yeah.
talking about weaponizing the government, the Department of Justice, whatever, and going after people.
Targeting enemies. Yeah.
Like we're not there yet on a large scale, but this is certainly a very big red flag that like if you can, I mean, yeah, the guy's not dead, but
Right. But if you can take someone away without any respect to their rights and without any due process, that opens the door for doing this again and again and again, right? And it sends a signal to other people who might disagree with your policies going forward and
yeah.
might be tempted to protest and now are maybe scared of it, right? I'll also say, as this is an aside, right? We're not talking about immigration tonight, but Khalil was here legally, right? He was registered. He had a green card. And so for an administration that has touted itself as kind of the defender of legal migration, legal immigration, common sense measures to keep track of people once they're in the country, this is a total, I mean, if I were immigrating, this would dissuade me from registering because they knew exactly how to find this guy because he had followed all the legal procedures, right? He was a green card carrying student. And so, to claim that you're the party or the administration that is for legal immigration, you're certainly not sending that signal to anyone by now punishing legal immigrants, right?
Mhm.
For their political views, which certainly doesn't seem very American.
Yeah, well, I mean, if he had 5 mil, he could have got the gold card. So that would have been a nice thing for him to have,
Uh,
unfortunately.
yeah, but I mean, it extends beyond, right, just Mahmoud Khalil. Um, Now Trump is kind of threatening to cut funding to all universities if these illegal protests happen, right? And again, what defines a legal versus an illegal protest? Good luck trying to figure that definition out in real time. Uh, Again, the First Amendment defends the right um, for assembly, right? For gathering in a protest. And so illegal protest on campus, I'm not quite sure what that even means, but clearly Trump's planning on punishing institutions that host these things or allow them to take place.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, all that to say, for all of the bluster about defending free speech, this administration is taking an active role in government censorship of free speech, right? If it runs counter to their views, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine that the same people that are talking out of one side of their mouth about, embracing democracy, embracing free speech, are at the same time turning around and doing this kind of stuff. But this is the kind of double standard that I'm afraid we've already kind of gotten numb to.
Yeah, and it ultimately, I think, comes back to the issue that we're not really going to be able to, as a country, get on the same page and even acknowledge this because we're living in these two separate realities where,
Yeah,
there's going to be some sort of argument to justify why this Mahmoud Khalil guy should have been deported and so forth. And we're going to have our news networks, whether it's Truth Social or Fox or whatever, parroting one interpretation of this, and then we're going to have alternative interpretations. And it's tough to see where this all leads optimistically when we're now getting real serious infringements on our First Amendment rights coming from the President of the United States, and we can't even agree that that's happening
right.
because it's
Yeah.
again that Spider-Man meme of, well, we see this happening and are pointing it
Who's
out, but
policing? Yeah,
they'll say, well, look at campuses, you're not letting you know far right speakers
neo-Nazis
have their
speak.
voice.
So yeah,
And so there's like it's like this false equivalency, I think, of uh, you know, once, well, I mean, it's just, yeah, I'm not optimistic in this respect because I think the ultimate answer, like, if we want to really zoom out, the ultimate answer is that we need to have an incredibly educated citizenry, right? This is what Dwight Eisenhower thought when he became
Yeah,
president. That's why he created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in his first year in office, which then branches off in part into education and health and human services, right?
that's right. Yeah,
Like we that president uh, put a real premium on education because we have to be able to have rational arguments
yeah.
about these types of things. And if we can't, then it's probably going to get ugly. I don't even know where that leads. I don't really know what that entails, but we have to find some way as a society to get back to agreeing at least on like what is free speech, who's who's infringing on it. Is it a social media company that has that right, or
Yeah,
is it the federal government?
right.
And what's the difference there?
Critical thinking, critical reading, right. Rational debate about this kind of stuff is the only way to get away from this kind of tribal, you know, alternate reality that we keep finding ourselves in, where some people sound the alarm and other people think it's totally justified, whatever that action is, right? And that's true, that's true for First Amendment issues like free speech. It's true internationally, like we've already talked about in previous episodes. It's true for um, whatever Doge is, whether you think it's a cost-cutting chainsaw or a total
Grift.
racket, yeah, grift. But yeah, unless we can start to think critically and start to have conversations with one another about it, it's not getting better. So it's a bleak note to end on. But what are we talking about next time we get together, Josh? If people keep tuning in.
Yeah, I mean, I think tariffs are kind of in the news on a daily basis, so I think it's probably time.
Semi-daily, right? They're there, then they get
Well,
revoked.
that's true.
They're there, then they get
That's
revoked.
true. Yeah. Yeah, you can only short the stock market so many times.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll talk about tariffs, but we won't get too economic. We'll talk about the history. I have a particular, I want to talk about Canada, why we're picking on our neighbor. Um, and yeah, I think that's where we're headed next anyway. So thanks for
Sounds good.
tuning in. Thanks for talking, Josh.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. It's been a
Uh,
long day, but this was good.
that's right. It's always been a long day, but these are good conversations. So
Yeah.
we'll see you next time. All
All right.
right.
Yeah, thank you.